Happy 2025, everybody. We're so excited to kick off this year. Dr. Cann was just our back in the days before COVID, she was our very last in-person keynote speaker. And so we were reminiscing a little bit prior to everybody logging on, just how much has changed in this last 5 years. But it really is a pleasure to have her with us. She is brilliant, and we hope you enjoy her as much as we do. For those of you who may not know Roots and Roads, really our mission is twofold. One is to financially assist low-income hospice patients with services and items that aren't covered by health insurance. And then the other big thing that's way more public-facing is the end-of-life education that we do, which is why we're here tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, David Fife, to MC the evening with Dr. Candi Cann. David?
Thanks so much, Julie. Are we going to go forward, Jennifer? There we go. All right. So we want to take a moment and thank so many of you. These are individuals who are participants in tonight's session who donated to make this evening possible. We are so grateful to each one of you for all that you bring to our education sessions and the feedback that you offer, but especially for these donations so that we can make sure that we continue to offer these sessions free to the community. Thank you so much. And for our 2025 series sponsors, we're so grateful for Intermountain Centers and for Grace Health and Healing Center. Their donations, their sponsorships are going a long ways to help support this whole year-long series. So we're so grateful for that partnership with both of them. And tonight we pause for a beloved member of the Roots and Roads community. Monica Gonzalez, Jennifer Arvizu's sister, Moni, was a generous and beautiful person who volunteered with Roots and Roads for many years. We will miss her spirit and her radiant smile. We dedicate this year's education series, Ritual and Remembrance, to Monica Gonzalez. And now we begin again. It's so wonderful to see all of your beautiful faces. Tonight, we continue a conversation that our community has been part of for 25 years. And there's a beauty in reflecting on this truth, for by being part of this ongoing conversation, we realize that it isn't so much about finding answers as it is about discovering a path forward in community. So thank you all for joining your voice to this discussion. And tonight we continue the conversation. As we do this, we are grateful to welcome Dr. Candi Cann. She comes back to Roots and Roads, as Julie mentioned, for those of you who have been attending our education programs for years. It was in 2018 that Candi delivered the keynote address for our conference. She currently teaches at Baylor University. Her research focuses on death, dying, and grief, and she's especially interested in the intersections of marginality, diversity, and death technologies. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Cann, please go to the registration page, and there you will see in the bio, you can click on deathscholar.com. It's a gift to have Candi kick off our 2025 series, Ritual and Remembrance. Candi is a person who helps others feel at home right away, even discussing challenging topics. And she's an unusual presenter. When we were cleaning up the day-long conference back in 2018, she started picking things up and loading them in our cars. She is the only keynote presenter who has ever worked the cleanup crew. Candi brings a unique perspective to our conversation about death, dying, and grief practices. Thank you so much for being with us, Candi. We'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you, David and Julie, for that very generous introduction. I appreciate it. Let me get my PowerPoint up here. Right, can you all see that? Okay. So I am really excited to be here with you all, and I want to thank you for joining me today. My name is Candi. I'm a thanatologist. I put on my website Death Scholar just because that's a little bit easier to understand. A lot of people are like, what's thanatology? And it's essentially someone who studies death and dying and grief, anything having to do with death and dying. And today I really want to share how rituals can serve as a powerful tool for remembering, honoring, and integrating loss into our lives. So whether you're here because of a recent loss or you're simply seeking understanding and information, my hope is that this talk provides some sort of insight and possibly solace. Together, we'll journey through a few cultural practices, talk about theories of grief, and then I want to give you some tools that I think might be helpful on that journey. But before I begin, I do want to pause. And I know we're honoring Jennifer's sister, but I also want to ask those of you who you will honor tonight, who you want to make space for in your life tonight as we talk about grief rituals. So I'm just going to take a few seconds to think about them and to honor them while I light my candle here. And with this light, we honor the light that those that have gone before us have brought into our lives and the love that they have brought, the meaning, and we are grateful for their presence and their continued love, even in their absence. Grief is, in many ways, our love hollowed out. It's a space that they leave behind. And this is why it really is important to honor the dead, to talk about the dead, and to make space for them in our conversations, in our daily lives, and in the landscapes that we inhabit. There's a lot of cultural assumptions about grief. It is, in fact, a universal experience, but the way we understand it varies greatly depending on culture, on the society we live in, and even the medical system in which we inhabit. What is considered, for example, normal grief? These questions shape how we're allowed to process loss. And in many societies, particularly the American one, we find phrases like move on, find closure, or get over grief. And these phrases suggest that holding on to memories are unhealthy. We also see the pathologization of grief. Oh, what a big word. We find that the DSM manual, which allows us to bill and code our healthcare system for our copays when we go to visit a grief therapist, says anyone grieving longer than 2 weeks is considered to have prolonged grief. Anyone who has lost someone knows it takes much more than 2 weeks to kind of feel like yourself again, or to come to grips with the loss or the death of someone. So in Western culture, grief is often treated as a private and a solitary experience. And if you contrast this, for example, with African traditions, where you have community mourning rituals, you have wailing ceremonies, and you might participate in a group song to honor the deceased. You can also contrast this with even Jewish ceremonies or Jewish traditions, where the practice of sitting Shiva provides a structured, community-based mourning period where friends and family come to gather to support the bereaved. So these cultural variations remind us that grief is not one size fits all. And it's not a one size fits all experience either. Today, I want to challenge some of these, what I believe to be restrictive assumptions, and to explore the ways that we can embrace grief as an ongoing adaptive journey rather than a task to complete. So many cultural expectations about grief are embedded in the language that we use when we talk about death, the ways that we approach dying, and the rituals that surround death and grief. For example, in some Western societies, there's an implicit expectation that grieving should be both discreet and time limited. Anniversaries of a loved one's death may be marked with a quiet moment of reflection, but societal presence for grief is often limited to the immediate aftermath of the loss. In contrast, other cultures emphasize public displays of mourning. If you remember my last talk in 2018, in parts of Indonesia, the Toraja people hold elaborate funerals where the deceased are kept at home for weeks, months, or even years, treated as if they're still part of the family. I'm not sure, do you guys see this red?
Yes. Jennifer, who's the queen of technology, do you have any words of wisdom on this scribble
I
board?
don't know why happened.
I thought that was like some creative thing you were saying.
No,
Like, we're not doing
at first
this.
I was like,
It
Yeah,
looks
I
like
don't know.
someone might have annotated.
oh, there
one.
we go.
There we go.
good.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Good work.
That was kind of cool though. It did go, I agree, Julie. It went with what I was saying. It was like, exit out. But okay, so part of what we need to do is really discuss whether these normative grief models are actually that healthy for us. So right now, oh, someone did that again. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Right now, what we see as a dominant grief model is the Kubler-Ross model, right? And it's kind of descendant. So if it's not Kubler-Ross, it's one of the kind of variations off of it. So Kubler-Ross, if you're not familiar with it, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross comes up with the grief model for dying. It's actually not for grief, but then it gets misapplied to grief. And so what you see is the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this becomes one of the most recognized frameworks in Western culture. But you also see other models kind of tack onto that. You get Warden's task of mourning. You get various stage-based models. And what we found is that while it's helpful for understanding some aspects of grief, this model presents grief as a linear and a resolvable process. And in reality, grief is far more complex and cyclical. I have no idea what is going on here. I apologize.
Apologies, everyone. If you are clicking the annotate button, if you could just make sure not to do that during the presentation, that would be great. I'm going to try and get everyone back there in just a moment.
Even if I
I
wanted
am
to.
now unmuted. Okay,
Yeah.
so jumping back in, I love this though. It's been kind of fun to see. So jumping back in, we do see certain cultural models in other cultures that often approach grief from a communal and a spiritual process rather than a psychological one. And I think this is a really important distinction. So for example, in Maori traditions in New Zealand, you have the Tangihanga, or the Tangi, the funeral rites, and these involve extended storytelling, song, and collective mourning over several days. And what that does is those rites then emphasize shared healing over individual progression. Unfortunately, many of the grief theories that are really dominant within our culture and that most people know through kind of pop cultural views of grief, they overlook such cultural nuances and they frame them as exceptions rather than equally valid expressions of mourning. And by recognizing these more diverse approaches, we can move beyond the limitations of stage-based grief models and embrace more inclusive understandings. And honestly, I believe if we can do that, we actually will make space for grief in our lives, and then we will be able to kind of move through life carrying our grief and learning how to live with it instead of trying to get rid of it and live in spite of it. So there's little awareness of grief at the collective or the communal level. And that's really illustrated, especially in the United States, where we have no federal bereavement leave. The United States is one of the only industrially advanced countries that does not have a federally mandated bereavement leave. We instead leave it up to individual companies. And what that means is that grief is often navigated very differently within different corporate structures. And there's a lot of variation on what grief actually means and how long you should do it. And as a result, there's no kind of formalized structure in which people can operate. Some companies will give 3 days. That's considered a pretty generous bereavement leave. Some only a few hours to attend a funeral. So this is a really important part of why we have a difficult time grieving as a collective society. Grief is also seen through largely a monolithic lens. It's often centered on non-normative it's often centered on non-traumatic grief experiences. All right, so let's continue. So that's a lot of bad news, right? I do have some good news though. Since the 2000s, there's been an expansion of awareness regarding grief theory. So one of them is that there are a lot of different experiences, and there's a shift in awareness of grief from merely being a personal experience to the collective experience that we all have. I think COVID and the pandemic has definitely demonstrated this. There's also a shift in awareness of the need for better work-related bereavement policies. I, of course, have been saying this since I started at Baylor, where I teach, and we now have a formal bereavement policy. So it's one of the things I'm most proud of here at Baylor. We've also seen death talk and discussions of grief increase and become more acceptable. And then I would add that technology has also helped to spread awareness, mainly because people are in conversations with other people who have experienced loss. And so technology has enabled a lot of conversation around death, dying, and grief. And in this way, social media has also helped push the DIY model, which I think can be negative and positive. So some people would say it's not great to have a DIY model because then you lose out on this kind of formalized ritual structure, which can be true. But in a society that's increasingly non-religious, you also see that having that DIY access allows people to be creative and create new rituals for them and their grief experience. So I do think we're seeing a lot of changes here in terms of grief. And here's my favorite picture. So the one on the left, this is my favorite depiction of the way stage-based models say they work versus the reality of how grief actually works. It is messy, it is nonlinear, and it's not always easy to predict. So on the left side,
Apologies, Candy. I'm sorry. We still seem to have difficulties with the annotation. If you can reshare your screen, there should be an option where you can disable annotations.
disable what?
The annotations, participant annotations.
Where is that?
So if you
Are you also a co-host or?
Yeah, but unfortunately I'm not able to do that. Sorry, everyone.
All right. See, this is the very first session of the year.
Yeah, no, it's good. Okay, so there's annotate. How do I disable it?
If you go to more, I think there should be like a setting for that. You see it?
Disable annotation for others.
Yes, please.
Okay, you
Thank
all have been punished.
you.
Not allowed to annotate.
And then
Thank you.
Candy, if you wanted to turn your camera back on, I think that when we had the last little mishap, it went off. There we
Okay,
go.
there we
Perfect.
go.
All right, here we go
Here's
again.
me. Here's my screen, and no annotation. Sorry about that, guys. We've always got to have, like, you know, the first one where we have some technical difficulties. Thank you for bearing with us. We're very grateful. But hey, I think the annotation fits perfectly with this slide. If you take a look at it, the annotation is what happens if you don't talk about your grief. Okay, if you don't make room for your grief, what you're trying to do gets covered and it becomes really messy. So you have to be able to talk about your grief. You have to make room for death. You have to make room for the people who have died and to really work through it. Because otherwise it does get really tangled and messy. Okay, so I actually think it's just a great symbol, and I think it was meant to be. All right, so I have given you the theories I don't like. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, stage-based theories. I find them somewhat problematic, right? They're very American. They're very neat. We love stages. We love checklists. Like, it is like, honestly, it's my favorite thing to do when I go to the store. I have a list and I'm like checking it off. But grief does not work that way. Grief is not linear. It's super messy. But we have to make room for it, right? Because if we don't make room for it, it will make room for us. And that's really the bottom line. So what theory do I recommend? And that's continuing bonds theory. And the people who came up with continuing bonds theory are Nickman, Silverman, and Class. And essentially it emerged from Dennis Class's time in Japan. He spent some time over there where ancestor reverence is deeply embedded in the cultural practice. Families often will maintain altars in the home for 1 year following a death. They will put a photo of the deceased. They will make offerings of incense and candles and fresh food and flowers, etc., and prayers to and on behalf of the deceased. And so you have this kind of ongoing relationship in which you continue to have a relationship with the dead, but they're in your home. So similarly, we could think of Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, where families create ofrendas or altars adorned with photographs, favorite foods, and mementos of the deceased. So these rituals reinforce the idea that the dead remain a part of the family's life. The difference with Japan is just you leave it up for 1 year, and so you make regular offerings. And I will say this is actually something I experienced when I lived in Japan as well. I did graduate school in Japan, in Tokyo, and my Japanese language teacher took me to her home. Her dad had just died, and the family had an altar of him in the living room. So it was really funny because we were driving to her house and she said, "I hope you don't mind sleeping in the room where my dad is." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And it turned out it was the altar of her dad, but the family really believed that her dad had a presence there. And I felt it very comforting. One, it was an honor to me that she trusted me with her dad. And two, it was just great because I felt like he was looking out for me. And so I didn't mind at all. But I will say I can understand where Class gets his continuing bonds theory from, having experienced this myself. So the idea in continuing bond theory is that rather than letting go of the deceased, you renegotiate the meaning of your loss over time. Death, of course, is permanent, but grieving and mourning can, in its own way, maintain the presence of the deceased in the web of the family so that they continue to have a role in the memories of the bereaved. In other words, in a way, that person loved you. That love has not gone away. And part of the reason why you do grieve is because they loved you, right? So you're making space for that love to still exist in a new way, even though the person is no longer there. So by incorporating these different practices, continuing bonds theory provides a more dynamic and compassionate framework for understanding grief. Now I have a couple more cute cartoons. So at the core of continuing bonds theory is the notion that we don't recover from grief. It's not something that we actually do move on from. It's simply something we learn how to carry in life with us. So importantly, having continuing bonds is normal. It's healthy, and it may even help us cope better and help us to heal so that we can live our lives with our loss instead of trying to move beyond them. I think my favorite description here is Anne Lamott. She writes about how grief is like breaking your leg, and that you learn to dance, but you will always have a limp after you break the leg. So it heals, but you still feel it. It's still, you know, when it gets cold at night, your leg hurts. And when you overexercise, it aches. So that's what grief is like. It's not something that goes away and that we get over. It's just something we learn how to carry with us. So I really like these little cartoons because I think they kind of demonstrate what continuing bonds looks like. Now, there's lots of really cool rituals of caring for the dead. Around the world, rituals help people honor and to stay connected to their loved ones. For example, in Ghana, elaborate coffins shaped like significant symbols of the descendant's life, such as a fish for a fisherman, are used to celebrate their legacy. Crazycoffins.com is their website, but you can see, and in Ghana, it's really traditional to have a beautiful, very artistic coffin, which kind of demonstrates the person in their life. And in South Korea, you have people who will convert the ashes of loved ones into colorful beads, keeping them as keepsakes. In Islam and in Judaism and in Buddhism, it's customary to wash the body of the dead before you bury them. You offer food and you light candles and say prayers and you offer flowers. So there's lots of different ways in which rituals demonstrate our love for the deceased through care. And that care is often physical, embodied, and in fact, actionable. Now, while some people may believe that the dead also look after the living in return, we do see that, for example, with Chuseok in Korea, with Qingming in China, with Dia de los Muertos in Mexico. There are some cultures that believe that there's actually a kind of more transactional relationship. The dead can come back and visit the living and beseech the gods on their living relatives' behalf. Many simply believe that the act of caring for those who cannot care for us back is in many ways a sacrificial act of love. So regardless of whether these acts of caring are viewed as transactional or sacrificial, it's clear that performing these acts also allows us to do something for and on behalf of the dead. And in this way, we're able to continue our relationship, right? We are making space for caring for the dead in the landscape of the living. And this allows us in turn to make room for conversation, to remember them, and to honor those that formed us and made us who we are. So in this slide, you'll see I have several different examples. On the left is in China, it's traditional to burn what's called spirit money. And so you give the deceased money that they can use in their afterlives. It's really fun because you also give them like paper houses and paper iPads and paper iPhones. And then on the top is, this is in Korea. Chuseok is like, it's known as a Korean Thanksgiving. It's kind of like Dia de los Muertos though, because you go to the actual graveyard, and you pay your respects to your ancestors, and then you pour them some wine, you give them some food. So there's a sense in which you still actively care for the deceased. And then on the top right is pan de muerto bread, which I love to say, you know, the yeast of the bread kind of symbolizes the resurrection and the resurrection of the body, in the same way that the yeast causes the bread to rise. And so there's a sense in which food traditions can also symbolize death beliefs. And then, of course, on the bottom right, most people are familiar with the sugar skulls. I really love, this is something we did in 2018. We set up a little ofrenda, but the sugar skulls are there. We have this tradition also in China. The sweetness can overcome the bitterness of death. So it's meant to remind you that everyone will die at some point in their lives. But I love the fact that it's using sugar to do that. So there's this kind of juxtaposition of the actual, the difficult death, but it's juxtaposed against the sweet of the sugar. So, all right. So to remember the dead is to bring their memory back into our lives in meaningful ways. And that doesn't mean living in the past, but creating a space in which grief and love can coexist together. So I purposely put this term, I separated remember, because I think this is a very helpful analogy. But think of it like a phantom limb. The absence is always there, but acknowledging it can help us heal. So phantom limbs, that's a name that doctors give to limbs that have been lost when a patient loses like part of their leg or part of their arm. And often people who have phantom limbs will also experience what's known as phantom pain. That doesn't mean the pain's imaginary. It's very, very real, and it's excruciatingly painful. The pain is real and experienced, but doctors have found that one of the best ways to manage that pain is to hold a mirror up to the other limb to kind of trick the brain into seeing the limb. And this allows a person to better manage the pain because now they can see the limb, and in that way they're able to kind of control and manage the pain that they experience. So I want to suggest that making space for the dead is similar to this idea. We have a part of us that's cut out, and now we only feel pain. But by making space and acknowledging the dead person, the deceased person's role in our life, and by giving them space again, we can allow ourselves a place to come and experience our grief, and also to remember the love that we experienced with the deceased. In other words, I don't believe it's a coincidence that we use this word of remember to bring back memories of the dead. We must remember them if we are to carry our losses through life and to learn how to live again with their absence. So by honoring the dead allows us then to recognize the depth of our loss while celebrating the love that we shared. And so by integrating practices that honor that loss, that honor that absence, and that honor the person that has died or the pet that has died, we can also transform grief from a source of pain into love and remembrance. So with my next slide, I have 10 different ideas, and there's many more. These are just a few. But there's lots of really great ways to honor your loss. So I'm going to go through these to offer some suggestions. The first one, you could choose a plant or tree or flowers that were meaningful to the deceased or symbolize qualities that you associate with them. And you could even mix some of their ashes with the soil or bury a small personal token beneath the roots. As the plant grows, it begins to symbolize their life continuing in a new form. And this is nice because you can do this in your own yard. You don't have to actually leave your home to visit anywhere. But it gives you this way to also commune with nature while transforming the grief that you're experiencing. Another one is carrying a keepsake or a token. You can transform a small personal belonging of the deceased into wearable jewelry. Most of you have probably seen this. Funeral homes often offer ash lockets, but you can also carry hair. You can even turn a piece of a shirt into a small token that you wear. You can even turn people into diamonds or glass sculptures. There's lots of things that you can actually do. And it just kind of depends on whether you have ashes or a body, but you don't really even need that. You can just take something that they loved and turn that into a meaningful symbol that you carry with you. My ring, for example, is from my mom, and I always wear it like for things like this. If I'm giving a talk or I have like something that's meaningful to me, I wear my ring because I want her to be with me as I go through these kind of big moments of my journey. You can share a meal with your loved one. You can cook their favorite dish. You can create a symbolic feast. You can set a place at the table for them. And during the meal, it gives you an opportunity to share stories with each other. You can play their favorite music. You can light a candle in their memory. And you can repeat this ritual on anniversaries, on birthdays, or whenever you feel the need to connect. My uncle, after we lost a lot of people in our family, he actually created a cookbook with all the recipes from his parents' generation. And it was really fun because he put together, they're really gross recipes. A lot of them are like raw hamburger sandwiches and just random weird stuff that people liked. But it's also a great way to like read the recipes and be like, oh, I'm going to make grandma's cake tonight. And so it gives me a way to kind of reconnect. You can do things like create a memory jar or a book or a quilt or a teddy bear. You gather your memories from friends or family, your own reflections, and you write them down. Or you can then you can read a memory aloud each week. My mom, she actually put together, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she put together a book about her life. And it's just a short question for every day. And so it's really easy because I could just be like, oh, today is January 16th. I'm going to read what she put that day. But you can also do things. I met a woman on a train who she made a teddy bear out of, her husband had just died. She made a teddy bear out of her husband's ties and gave them to her two daughters for their Christmas present. And it's a beautiful way to kind of figure out what to do with the clothes that a loved one leaves behind, but you also are able to kind of create something special that other people can hold on to, or you yourself can hold on to. You can do symbolic artwork or music. You can create a piece of art, a painting, a collage, sculpture, a song. Again, if you do have ashes, you can throw the ashes into paint. You can even you'll see this later on down farther, you can get a tattoo. You can throw the ashes into the tattoo. So there's a lot of things you can do with artwork and music that will honor the person. I also like this one. A daily mantra or affirmation. You can develop a mantra that embodies the wisdom, the love, the values of the deceased. You can repeat the mantra during moments of quiet reflection, imagining their strength and guidance becoming part of you. There's really a different ritual for every person, and for a different ritual that will honor every person that has died. And then you can do a shadow box. It's similar with where you gather different meaningful objects and put them together. The tattoo I already mentioned. My first book, I basically interviewed a bunch of different tattoo artists and went to different tattoo studios. And this is actually the most common thing for young people to do. It was often, I think it was like 70% of all young people, their first tattoo was actually in honor of someone that they had lost or something they had lost, which kind of surprised me. But it's also kind of seen as a badge or an emblem, right? So it's very symbolic, and it allowed conversation. People would say, oh, what does that tattoo mean? And then they could say, oh, this was for my grandpa who died. And then they would be able to have a conversation about the deceased. So these are not simply rituals for you, they also open space up in which you can really think about and talk about the dead. And then I like this one, it's elemental ritual. You can use natural elements such as fire, water, earth, air to represent their spirit. And you can write a message or draw a symbol and then scatter it, burn it. There's lots of different things you can do. And then you can think about how their energy returns to nature and continues to flow through the world. Finally, there's legacy projects. You can dedicate a new hobby, a cause, or a project to someone's memory, volunteering, for example, creative pursuits or skills that they valued. And as you engage in the project, you honor the memory by channeling their influence into your actions. So there's lots of different ways and rituals that you can create that will help you. The most important thing is to make that space. It doesn't matter what ritual it is, but I really encourage you all to choose a ritual so that you have the space in which you can continue your relationship with the deceased. So grief is not a process to complete. It's a journey to navigate. And by remembering those we've lost, we create a space where their love and influence continues to shape our lives. Now, I'm excited for you all because I am just the first one. And now that we've got the technical difficulties figured out, it's going to get even better from here. So we start in February. You're going to learn about indigenous cultures and death. And then in, is this March? Yeah, you'll learn about pet grief, which I think is one of the most traumatic experiences that people experience, but we don't have a space in society to really talk about pet loss. And so these are just some of the amazing programs that Roots and Roads has put together for you, an incredible lineup of speakers and authors to help you navigate this journey and to walk with you in your grief. Stop sharing there.
Thank you so much, Candi. We have time now. If people would like to unmute themselves, they're welcome to ask a question. And if you also have the option of putting it into the chat, and we can lift that up as well. And does anyone have something that they're ready to ask now? Because I have a whole list of questions, but I'm trying not to monopolize. Please, Steve, go ahead.
Recently was told that commenting about somebody's tattoo is no longer politically correct. And so it wouldn't actually open up conversation. Have you heard that rule, or is that just somebody's opinion?
Could you repeat that?
Yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I heard recently that talking about somebody's body art, tattoos, isn't kosher. It's not okay to do that anymore. And as first I heard of that, I was very surprised. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. So thank you for bringing it up. It is changing, right? I think part of it is now it's not really considered appropriate to comment on someone's body at all. But I think it'd be okay to be like, oh, I like your tattoo, or something like that. But I do think I think it's a really valuable point. And it's definitely, it's something that we're seeing shift culturally. But I do think that that's partly why people get tattoos, right? Is because they do get them as badges and emblems. But yeah, it's a great point. And I can't give a blanket answer because I think it would depend on the context and, who you're engaging with.
My own experience, Candi, is that people have never taken it ill when I've done this.
Yeah, I agree.
Kate, did you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Dr. Cann, I was wondering if you had any recommendations for books or other resources about ritual design.
Well, I really don't. These are just kind of things I've put together over the years. Maybe that's something that I need to write.
I'll race you.
Yeah.
If it's okay just to jump in, Kate, there's a great book. I'm not particularly religious, but I went into a store once the woman was Catholic who owned the store, but she also loved Buddhism. And so she had all these different texts. And I found this great book called The Way We Pray. And it really is about ritual, but across cultures and religions. And so that might be one that could be helpful, The Way We Pray.
Great, thank you.
And I think too, I love, Candi, how you talk about ritual and you talk about a do-it-yourself model that many of us don't have a connection anymore to a religious or cultural traditions around death, dying, and grief. And I remember the last church I pastored, there was someone who died in the community, and three of the older women in the congregation grabbed me as the young pastor and said, "All right, come with us." And so they took me to the family's home and they said, "We are going to teach them how to mourn. They need to learn how to mourn." And so we really sat there and they taught people how to be quiet together. They taught people how to share a cup of tea or coffee together, to start to tell stories and to be okay with tears, and also to be okay with not saying anything, but to create a space for all of those things to happen. I thought it was fascinating, but it's and really important. But the truth is, it's not like you take something off of a liturgical shelf and then just implement it. That ritual is a creative process that you've talked about, and so much is of what we bring to it we bring all the senses to it as well. It's very tangible. You talk about food, you talk about incense, you talk about candles, you talk about all of that. And I love how it's not something that needs to be imposed, but it's something that we do together.
I love that they were willing to sit there and teach how to mourn, because it's not something we know how to do, right?
No,
And it's hard. It's uncomfortable.
yeah.
This isn't a question, but just as you were talking earlier, Candi, I wrote down, there are death cafes, right, which are sort of loosely facilitated, organic, but I almost thought, we dream of creating this center, a physical space for ritual and remembrance. And so I'm always jotting down ideas about what sort of programming could we do, or what sort of features would it have. And so I love the idea of a sharing circle where people bring their rituals or just talk about their rituals, right? Because grief is as unique as we are, and rituals are too. So I love that idea as well.
I've done 2 death over dinners, or 3. I've led 2 virtual death over dinners, and then I participated in an in-person death over dinner. And to me, that's been the most meaningful experience, just because you do share and you listen and you learn so much from the other participants, and you start to realize that you're not alone. I think part of the problem is we never talk about this. And then you feel very isolated in your grief, right? So it's really lovely to be able to actually share those experiences and to know you're not alone.
Hmm. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about the continuing bonds theory and grief. Is it also it feels to me as if this affirmation of an ongoing relationship with the deceased, with your loved one, it also allows for that relationship to continue to develop and change. That relationship is something that is ongoing, and that we, just like memories change, we relate to people, and that can grow as well. Are there cultural examples of that you've seen?
Well, so I will answer this in a little roundabout way, but the first thing I want to say is continuing bonds is really big in Europe and in the UK. So I do believe that part of it is tied to our medical care systems, because I think the medical care system creates a cultural worldview. And then that is reinforced through the medical care system. So here with privatized healthcare, the expenses of dying are all on us as individuals, and then the actual death experience and, interment or disposal, cremation, and then grief, all of those things are very individualized. Whereas in Europe and the UK, you have kind of government sponsored programs. Are not really church sponsored today. They used to be, but now they're really government sponsored. But because of socialized healthcare, there's a lot of interest in government spending on programs that promote conversation around dying and death and grief, right? So I do think it's interesting to me how resistant I have found some Americans to be resistant to continuing bonds. And they're like, oh, that's not, especially like the Christian evangelical circle, right? And part of that is they find that problematic, and because you have the one and done theology. You're resurrected, you go to heaven. There's no one there to have a relationship with, right? But I then challenge that, because there's a lot of Protestant Christians in particular. Catholic Christians don't really have an issue with it because they have the regular masses and masses for the dead, and they pray and ask God to intercede on behalf of the dead. So Catholics get this topic and get this kind of grief theory a little bit better. But with Protestants, it's amazing how many don't like the continuing bonds theory, but then they have no problem with ghosts and the notion of ghosts. And I'm like, that's the same thing. These ghosts that are lingering in corners and haunted houses, like those are spirits, right? So I think part of it is, my goal is to challenge this narrative and to get people to understand that even if you are a Protestant and, for you can't continue to have, personal relationship with the deceased. Why not? Why can't you continue to have a personal relationship with the love that that person had for you? That's something you can do. So this has been kind of my big personal MO, if you will, because I do think this form of this continuing bonds theory is the healthiest grief theory around. I feel like it's the one thing that has absolutely helped me. And I feel like it's something that in some ways is so integral around the world. And I feel like for some reason we've moved far away from this notion of continuing bonds and our desire to kind of contain death, to make it something that we can fit in a box and put away, and because it makes us uncomfortable, right? So, David, I don't know if that answered your, it was a very long kind of circular answer, but.
No, that's very helpful, actually. I was wondering if, you've seen lots of practices in different cultures and different countries where there is that ongoing relationship, whether it's continuing to have the body in the home for maybe years afterwards. Is there, have you seen that change how people view how that relationship has developed? Is it ongoing with that person, or how the family dynamics change? I'm wondering how that maybe would alter our relationship to the deceased, as opposed to the way that so often we do it, where we have, and I laughed because, I worked in hospice for years, and even the best hospices maybe gave 3 days bereavement leave, and the whole business was around death and dying and grief. But a lot of times that wasn't even offered. So we have this, you're allowed to grieve for a very short amount of time. you're expected to be able to get past that and then start functioning just like you did before, as if we're not changed as human beings from the loss. Have you seen it help people with that process of change in tangible ways in other cultural traditions?
I feel like it does because there is that space, but the expectation is almost opposite of here, right?
Mm.
So in Korea and China, you're given weeks to mourn. You're given weeks to put things in order. And even then, that's not enough, right? But at least you're still paid. You're not worried about having to go back to work. I mean, I remember when my mom died, yeah, the day she died, my boss called and was like, "You need to get back to work," because I had taken off since she had cancer. And I was like, "My mom died today." And she was like, "Oh, you can have another week," you know? But so I went back, I took all my sick leave, all my vacation days, and I was a wreck. I mean, I couldn't function, right? And I tried, but we're worried about how are we going to provide for our families? How are we going to go back to work? I mean, so I really think it's a greater problem. But I think it's tied to capitalism, the medical care system. I really do think it's larger systemic issues. But the problem is we've quit challenging those issues and we've kind of blamed the victim. We blame the griever and say, well, you're clearly not dealing with this properly because you're not functioning. Well, no, actually, maybe society's got a problem. And maybe we need to really rethink how we do grief and how we do dying and make space for it, because then I think we actually could function better. So yes, I do think it functions much better. The problem is as countries become, as we've globalized and they become much more tied to all the benefits of capitalism, I think, you start to see more problems emerge. But that being said, I do think like in Asia, there's still this heavy emphasis on Confucian culture and honoring your parents and your ancestors. And so in that respect, they have lots of time off, right? But I do think it's also tied to the medical care system.
I hadn't heard anybody articulate it that way before, but it makes a lot of sense because in this country, especially, we have turned death and dying over to medicine, that it is a medical process and that it's taken away from the home and it's taken away from family. Is that then when someone becomes ill, there's a treatment and a diagnosis process that we go through, and we let go of that relationship. We're taken away from our roots in order to be treated. And I don't know if that's necessarily true in other countries and cultures that you're referencing, but I do think that has a strong influence then on our ability to talk about death and to grieve following that.
But doctors suffer too as a result, right? Because they're seen as failures. They view themselves as if they can't cure or so it has ramifications at all levels.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter just died. And I think he was the first president to be born in a hospital. And so there was this marked change of life transitions during that same time period of when he was born, from birth and death being taken cared for at home to the medical institution. And I do think that that's had a major effect on our culture and our society. I'm sorry, we're just having this conversation. Please interrupt us and jump in anytime. Elsa, thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to jump in. This is actually steering us a little bit differently, and I'm enjoying the conversation actually that you're having. But I sometimes wonder, and Candi, you may know this, has there been sitting down with a large group of people in this country, one by one, and asking, how do you deal with your grief and what do you do to ritualize or to honor the person who has died? Because as as you have talked, all kinds of things have popped into my mind about, I mean, I have a flannel shirt that belonged to my father. He died in 1996, and I wear that shirt. It's good quality. So, but these little things that maybe people do but they don't talk about, that are
Yeah.
sort of a ritual for them, just not recognized as that. So, but maybe studies have been done that way, Candi.
There are some studies. Again, I think you see, so one of the things ADEC, of course, the Association of Death Education and Counseling, is kind of the premier organization in the United States. So here it tends to be, our approach to death tends to be much more psychological as opposed to sociological or cultural, right? Whereas the UK, it tends to be much more sociological. Again, I think that has to do with the healthcare system and then the government kind of impetus, since it's much more of an individual experience here. You know, I think there are people who are trying to track this and document this, but what I've seen here, Elsa, is people who kind of see a dichotomy between religious rituals and individual DIY rituals. And I don't think it necessarily has to be a dichotomy. I think in some ways, like you said, people do these things on a regular level. They just may not talk about them, right? So they might do religious rituals and these individual DIY rituals, or they may just do the DIY stuff, or they may just do the religious stuff. But the thing about religion is it makes that space in a culturally accepted way in a community, right? And that's the one thing the DIY stuff doesn't necessarily do unless you intentionally incorporate it. So I think that's where I'm all for creating intentional rituals, but I also think the community really matters. And the community can be there and kind of offer support and guidance in ways that you hadn't even thought of. So I don't see it as a dichotomy, is my response. But I do think we need to have more conversations around this. Also, about the earlier conversation, I don't know if you're familiar with the organization Evermore, but they are working very hard to get federal bereavement legislation mandated. And so they have been actively campaigning across the country to implement some kind of federal bereavement leave. Because I do think when you leave it up to individual companies, it becomes problematic because there's too many discrepancies. But so Elsa, I hope that answered your question about the DIY. I love that you still have your father's shirt. That's great.
It is very interesting to bring in the communal aspect. We last year we focused uh, on education around grief and loss and skill building of how to show up for one another and support each other as we navigate grief in life and different types of losses. And what we also heard from people was, where is the community aspect of that? And ritual allows for that expression of a desire for healing and a creative process on a communal level. It touches us very deeply individually, but together we are able to express a loss that we all share as well. And I think that's very important in this navigation of grief, that sometimes we get lost on the counseling level of healing that can happen.
I agree. I remember when my brother died, my family in Boston, they're Irish Catholics, and my brother was not Catholic, but they had a mass said for him, and then they sent, you know, the dedication card from the priest in the parish. So that was really meaningful to me to know that there was this big community of people saying a mass just for my brother, and yeah, it was very touching and meant a lot to me. So I do think, you know, these communal rituals are important.
And they also serve the purpose of, we oftentimes don't know what to say, and we don't salute, and we don't know what to do. But it's a practice that allows us to share it through music, possibly through prayer, through other forms that fills that for us, that we don't have to know ourselves, that we can take part in
Yeah.
something that's been passed on to us. And there's, on lots of levels, there's that loss of community that draws us together around that process.
And that structure is so comforting, right? Because often you don't know what to do or how to respond, and just having the structure it's just really nice. I'm a very structure oriented person though, so I really like that. But yeah.
Becky, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just wondering, it just popped into my head about how the reconnection would work with like a collective grief that like a whole community went through, or I'm thinking back to pandemic times when all of us went through something, and how that we may have lost actual people, but there were also so many other things that people lost too, and how that reconnection would kind of work with that collective grief.
That's a great question, Becky, and I don't have an answer, but I do think it's important to have those conversations. I think you could have, a group come together like this and to discuss it. I mean, I know for me, I'm deaf, and so I read lips. I absolutely loved being on Zoom during the pandemic. It was like my favorite thing ever. And so I was so sad when I actually stayed online a year after everyone went back. We had some people that weren't ready to go back. But everyone would be like, oh, it's great, we're getting back to normal. And I was like, no, this is the first time I felt included. And now I have to, because it's exhausting for me to read lips. I have to, and I'm 90% deaf. And so for me to be in a classroom where I'm like constantly really working hard to kind of see what someone's saying, it just wears me out. And so I felt a grief when, I felt like as a disabled deaf person, here I was finally getting to, be in my world. And then everyone was like, oh, I can't wait to not be online. I was like, no, this is terrible. Like, I'm not going to understand anything. And, so I do think though that you have to have those conversations. You have to have like a place where, because I agree with you. I think, and the pandemic was just so traumatizing in so many ways. And then you're also exhausted, right? Because it's just everywhere you go, but there's nowhere where you can actually share it and work through this collective grief together. And I think the first thing is actually having these conversations, not just moving beyond them.
I think too, remembering back to the days of 9/11 and the need to come together to grieve, and how hard it was to find space to simply acknowledge the loss without the desire um, to act in response to that tragedy. And I think what Ritual can do, and I'm so excited that you all are here tonight to be part of this conversation and the start of this, because the whole year is going to be about our opportunity to explore the importance of ritual and learn from communities who practice different forms of remembering and ritual in this grief process. And again and again and again, what it does is it's a container that allows us to be in a space to acknowledge the loss and the pain and the grief without having to move forward and to focus on other things and collectively to do that. So I'm so excited that we can be part of this learning experience, and we're also going to provide opportunities for in-person practice this year. But it really is a practice. This is what we're trying to figure out together and to reclaim in many ways.
You guys are doing such important work. I'm so grateful for you.
Likewise.
Yeah, I would like to acknowledge also what Roots and Roads is doing in terms of bringing these challenging things forwards. It's a very special opportunity, and that it can happen across the country, internationally even. I don't know if you get people from other countries coming onto these calls, but it's wonderful what you're doing. And I mean, it's helped me in a lot of ways. And Candi, I was interested in the question about tattoos, because when I heard you speak in 2018, talking about on automobiles, roadside altars, but the tattoos, that gave me the courage at the hairdressers to say, you know, I'm really appreciating your tattoos. Do they have any special meaning? And she said, oh yes, the roses for my grandmother, you know, when she died, and she loved roses. And so I'm sorry if people are feeling like they can't do that. I suppose you have to be sensitive to the situation and the person, but that really opened something for me. So I'm sure a lot of people who are on this call are finding that this is a wonderful opportunity. So thank you to Roots and Roads.
Well, one of the things that we get to do with Roots and Roads is listen to you all and come up with new topics based on what you're most interested in. And we will continue to do that. We look forward to your feedback in our survey, and also just ideas that may pop into your head. Please send us messages and we'll do this. But we also hear when the conversation is winding down, and that's great. And so I'm going to turn things back over to Jennifer and Julie. But I first want to just say thank you so much, Candi, for this evening, for your
Thank you for
presentation.
having me.
I loved all of the additions of the red lines through things. I really thought you were doing it. I thought
I
you
planned
were
it that way.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. It got everybody's attention. And I think that you have started us off on a great path, and I look forward to this exploration together this year.
You guys are doing such important work.
Well, it's definitely an honor to do this work, and you know, just sort of go with the flow where folks want to learn, and what questions are out there, and just set time aside to do that. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Candi. It's always a joy. I love that you were our last in-person keynote, and here we are, you know.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
Wow.
definitely. And one of the things, you know, I think Elsa asked, we do get people, I mean, we've had people from Brazil and Turkey, and so it's kind of, we've stayed with this online platform because we are able to have speakers and participants from all over the world. But as David mentioned, one of the things that we miss is that in-person component. So our hope is that this year, at least quarterly, we'll sort of learn together online, and then some subset of us, whoever wants to, come together in person to practice ritual that we learn about. So we look forward to that. Jen, I don't know, are there other slides, or are we just winging it? Oh, there are slides. Jennifer's. Oh, yeah, Jen, take it away.
Okay, so as Julie and David were saying, we really do value your feedback because it helps inform kind of where we take things during the series. So you will be getting an email with a link to our survey if you don't mind filling it out for us. We are now sponsors over at Tohono Chul, so I think we will be doing another little giveaway. So if maybe the first 3 people to complete our survey will get tickets to Tohono Chul. It is local in Tucson, so we will probably need to keep it to the local responders. But if you plan to visit, let us know, and then I'll make sure and give you the tickets. And then with that, so that'll hit your mailboxes later this evening. And then I think David will talk to you about kind of what's coming up in the next couple months.
I barely need to because Candi did such a good job of introducing it. That was fantastic. But I encourage you highly to come back next month on February 20th. Dr. Ned Norris Jr. is a former chairperson of the Tohono O'odham Nation here in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. He is a gift to this community, and it is a special presentation that he doesn't normally offer this kind of a talk to the general wider community of Tucson. And so it is a unique chance to learn from O'odham traditions around death and dying and grief and remembering that I think that will be important to our own understanding of our grief and our own ability to remember, but it is an opportunity then to be able to dialogue with him after the presentation as well. So I encourage you, please come back. It'll be well worth it. And tell your friends about it as well. And then in March, we have Dr. Sarah Hogan, who is a joy to listen to. If you've ever had the opportunity to hear her before, she's out of California, but she is going to talk about grief of pet loss and the rituals that are important as we remember those loved ones as well. So you can register. It's already online to register for both of those sessions. The committee is working on the remainder months of the months throughout this year. We have very exciting. Do we have other? This is all the slides we have, right, for the upcoming sessions, Jennifer? Right? Okay. So, but we already have the first 6 months planned, and we're going to unveil them in the upcoming months. And so you're not going to want to miss that as well. But if you do have ideas, we're still planning the second half of the year, and we would love to hear your suggestions. Is this me too? Yes, they say. So we have sponsorship opportunities. If you're part of an organization, if you are an individual that just says, yes, I want to be one of the sponsors for this education series, if you're part of a business, the only way that we're able to keep bringing this to the community and this level of educational opportunity is because of our amazing donors and the sponsors. And so please consider how either organizations or businesses that you're part of or ways that you can help support us so that we can continue to bring these opportunities to everyone. I don't know. Do you have anything else to say?
The last few things will go by quickly because I know everyone's getting ready to kind of check out. But again, we're grateful to all the individuals who donated tonight. We just wanted to share a couple other ways that you can help support Roots and Roads. We've partnered with ShopRaise. So if you do any online shopping, you like to buy gift cards, that's a nice way to help support Roots and Roads, as well as Walmart Spark Goods. So if you shop online for Walmart or with Fry's, you can sign up and select Roots and Roads as your charity of choice. And then as we all get ready for tax time coming up here in April, we are a qualified charitable organization for the Arizona Charitable Tax Credit. So that if you made a donation tonight, you can claim that for your charitable tax credit. And our QCO number is there on the form. It's 22655. But if you haven't donated already, please think about donating. And it's very nice here in Arizona. You can actually split the donation. So if there is another charity that is dear to your heart, you can split that charitable tax credit between charities. So that is everything.
Thank you so much, everybody. We always love seeing you and learning from you, learning with you. And again, Candi, you are a joy. We're so glad to get to be with you again. And we'll just get in another 5 years, we'll just do this again, something like that.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Have a great night, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
See you
See
next
you next
time.
month. Yeah.
Bye-bye.